Tällä kertaa Kirjailijat karanteenissa jakso koostuu lähes yksinomaan haastattelusta, eli haastattelussa on brittiläinen kirjailija Ray Cluley. In case there are some non-Finnish speaking viewers, just bear with me, we'll switch to English in a second. Ja suomalaisille tiedoksi, että tämä haastattelu on myös tekstitetty suomeksi. Mutta Ray Cluley on tämän brittien Fantasy Awardin voittanut kirjailija. Sen lisäksi hän on ollut Ellen Datlown tällaisissa vuoden parhaat antologioissa mun laskujeni mukaan 5 kertaa, voi olla, että on enemmänkin. Ja hän on ollut myös tämmöisessä vuosikymmenen parhaat lajityyppinovellit tai kauhunovellit kokoelmassa kerran. Eli tämmöisiä niin kuin tämän lajityyppipiirissä hyvin arvostettuja tunnustuksia saanut kirjoittaja, hyvin tuottelias kirjailija myös, ja kuten haastattelusta käy ilmi, on myös tulossa kaiken näköistä tavaraa eri rintamilla, hyvin monipuolinen kirjailija. Tässä jaksossa puhutaan erikseen tai nostaa esiin muutama Ray Cluleyn tarina. Yksi niistä on The Whaler's Song-niminen novelli, ja se on ilmestynyt tässä Ellen Datlown The Devil and the Deep-antologiassa. Ja tämä The Whaler's Song oli nimenomaan se novelli, jonka kautta mä löysin Ray Cluleyn. Sitten siellä tulee puheeksi myös tämmöinen pidempi novelli tai oikeastaan pienoisromaani, joka on myös loistavasti luettuna äänikirjana olemassa, eli Water for Drowning. Sitten puhutaan ainakin Adrenaline Junkies-nimisestä novellista, ja se on ilmestynyt tämmöisessä antologiassa kuin The Porcupine Boy and Other Anthological Oddities. Suomalaiselle ainakin nimi hirviö, mutta että sieltä löytyy tämä Adrenaline Junkies-niminen tarina. Sitten tietysti Ray Cluleyn tarinoita on ilmestynyt novellikokoelmassa nimeltään Probably Monsters. Jo muutaman vuoden takaa, että sieltä ei löydy ihan näitä uusimpia, mutta siihen kannattaa ehdottomasti tutustua. Haastattelu tehtiin Skypella ja nettiyhteyden pykiminen ehkä vähän kuvapuolella häiritsee välillä. Ääniraita tulee onneksi täydellisesti. Mutta mitäpä tässä lässyttämään? Eli tässä Ray Cluleyn haastattelu.
Okay, welcome Ray Cluley. It's great that you found the time to have a chat with us. How is it going?
Oh, it's going good. Thanks for having me. It's very exciting.
You're enjoying the quarantine.
Yeah. It hasn't changed my life much, to be honest, because I pretty much stayed in anyway. So, but yeah, scary times, huh?
Yeah, but for writers, it's not that different, I suppose, for most of us anyway. I already gave a short intro of you in Finnish at the beginning, but how would you introduce yourself as a writer to maybe a new audience?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm a writer. I favour short stories above everything else, and of the genres, probably horror more than anything else, or at least weird or strange. If you're not a big fan of horror as a label, but I've also done some crime fiction, which I really enjoy, and a little bit of fantasy and a little bit of science fiction. Although even when I step out of the genres, they do tend to still end up being quite dark. But yeah, that's basically me. The short stuff, the scary stuff, if possible. Definitely want to weird you out a little bit if I can.
You already said that you write in many different genres. And I thought when I first started reading your stuff that you must have some other non-genre influences as well, because there seems to be a kind of a literary, even emotional scale in your stories. Some of it seems to come from somewhere else. Am I right about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think it started because my parents, they only had one bookshelf, bless them. They didn't read an awful lot, but what they had on their bookshelf was a diverse mix of things, and I read all of those as a kid. And that's where I discovered horror, but amongst other things. But I think probably because I was teaching for about 10 years or so, so it meant I was teaching a lot of the classics, and a lot of the really great, literature with a capital L kind of literature. and that definitely had an influence. I mean, it can be a hindrance as well as a help, because on the one hand it's showing you how it's done really well, and on the other hand you're thinking, I can't compete with this, I can't write this kind of stuff. But it all helps. I mean, especially as a teacher, when you're trying to break it down for a class and trying to show how these things work, that then obviously had its benefits on my own writing, because I could break my own stuff down, see what I was doing wrong, see what I was doing right, etc. So yeah, so definitely read outside the genre as well. Still do. I think you have to. I mean, it's age-old advice, I think every writer probably says, but read as much as you can and as widely as you can if you want to write anything decent, I think.
In an interview somewhere, I can't remember where this was, but you mentioned also that you always say that prose writers, or maybe was it genre writers, should read poetry.
Oh God, yeah, absolutely. I try to read poetry as all the time. I've always got some prose on the go and some poetry on the go if I can. Just because, I mean, one, it's beautiful anyway, and I think more people should read poetry. It's not what you might have read at school and been put off by when it was just the same old stuff. So modern poetry is absolutely gorgeous. But when done well, there's so much to poetry that it can do more economically than prose, and you can see how just a few turns of phrase can have the same impact, or more impact even, than what you might have laboured over in a big long old sentence or paragraph. And also they're just wonderful with imagery. Some of the juxtapositions and some of the images they come up with, like to describe a feeling or an emotion, and then that in itself can become a great tool for the prose writer to think, well, how did they do that? How can I do that without just ripping them off completely? What can I do in a similar vein? So yeah, I mean, and also they just inspire me. So if I'm ever feeling a little bit like sluggish with my own writing, I'll read some poetry, and then I fall in love with language all over again. I fall in love with trying to tell a story all over again that isn't necessarily plot driven. It's more emotive, or at least the poetry I tend to read is. So yeah, I 100% recommend it. It's brilliant.
Yeah, and I think that shows in your writing that you also read poetry. There's kind of that poetry in the prose. It's not just plot. It's not just the kind of story and how it goes forward. You already mentioned that. Was it like in Water for Drowning, and also in one of your short stories, there's this mermaid theme. I don't know if you've had to talk quite a lot about this, but it seems to be kind of an obsession. But did you mention that it's also there's a connection to poetry there?
Yeah,
T.S.
I mean,
Eliot.
that's the one. Yeah, so there was a particular line I've heard the mermaid singing each to each from his poem, the Prufrock poem, and I loved this idea. And that line has stuck and resonated, and I stole it. I completely unashamedly stole it as the title, but it kind of worked because the story was itself about the poem, and the narrator in the story was a fan of the poem, so it sort of fit without me just outright stealing it. But yeah, I mean, I love the sea and mermaids in particular, and yeah, it always seems to find a way into my fiction. I was talking to a friend recently actually, and he was quite amazed to realise that the sea terrifies me. And he's like, but you always write about the sea. I thought you loved the sea. I thought you were always in the sea.
Well,
and I'm like, no.
That's the reason.
Yeah, exactly. It's so frightening that I keep coming back to it over and over again. Hopefully not too repetitively. I'm hoping readers can see differences between all the stories. But yeah, I mean, that is my favourite sort of the boat I sail in, if you like.
I don't know if you've been to, it's kind of maritime museum in Hull in the UK, and they have a mermaid there in the museum, but it says probably fake.
Yeah, probably. It might be, it might not be. Yeah, I mean, that was one of the good things about Water for Drowning, is I was able to really delve into some of the background, not just like the mythology, but all the fake stuff, all the phonies, the half monkeys sewn to fish that were going around, all that kind of stuff. I got to explore that because the narrator, one of the characters in it, was also obsessed with mermaids. So I got to offload all of my obsession onto her and use it that way. But no, I've never actually seen it. I used to teach English language, and it used a leaflet that they had done to advertise this big aquarium in Brighton. And one of their advertisements was that it had a real life mermaid in there. Half beautiful woman, half fish, and all this kind of stuff. And that leaflet, I used to think, wow, imagine walking the streets in Victorian London and being given this thing that said, here you go, come and see a real mermaid. So yeah, I mean, I find it a bit of a shame as we develop that with fewer and fewer mysteries as we explain more stuff. But again, I don't know. I guess as we discover more, we're also finding new mysteries. But yeah, I think to have been of an age where you thought that might have existed, might have actually been real, then I think that could have been fantastic fun.
Yeah, mysteries that we tend to find nowadays, I think they're of a different kind, a bit scarier, more nihilistic.
A little less wonder, a little more, oh my God, there's another way that we can die now.
How about, we have to also talk about genre influences. Could you name any, maybe we could talk about horror writers if you prefer. Which are the ones that have made a great impact on you?
Well, at first it's the same old names you might get from any other horror writer. So it would have been Stephen King, and obviously he had a massive impact because he was huge. This was a time when he dominated the entire. In fact, he still does. You go to the horror section, it's mostly King. So yeah, it was Stephen King and lots of the older classics like Edgar Allan Poe, and Bram Stoker's Dracula was my favorite book, and Lovecraft before I knew all the bad stuff about him. All this kind of stuff, that was my teenage years. And then as I started to research venues for sending my work, I found that modern day writers were having much more of an impact on me. So Black Static, the reason I'm really pleased to ever be in that is because I was reading it long before I ever submitted anything to them. And everyone who was writing for Black Static, my peers, like now, I guess, were my inspiration and my motivation to write that kind of work. So people like Stephen Volk and Stephen Dines and Linda Rucker, all these people, James Cooper, he was in there a lot. These were the people that I was thinking, okay, this is how I need to write, in this style to get into this magazine. Turns out that's not the case at all. Andy was quite diverse in the sorts, but these were people that inspired me. In fact, I used to have a little logo next to my computer that said "Work until your idols are your rivals."
Yeah, that's
good. I mean, it makes me sound more competitive than I really am, because I don't consider them rivals as such. But it did always, whenever someone I like writes a good story, it does force me to up my game a bit, because I'm thinking, oh wow, that was good. Right, I've got to try and do something like that now. So it's good, I think, to have that kind of slight competitiveness, but not with any of the nastiness that you might associate with competition.
Yeah. Could also have to ask you about research. I think that's one of the kind of exceptional elements in your writing, because the first story I read from you was from Ellen Datlow's The Devil and the Deep, the anthology.
Oh, the Whalers one.
Yeah, and I stopped reading the anthology after your story. That's when I had to find out everything you've written. No, not yet everything, but I started kind of binge reading after that. And there, I don't know why, but as a writer, I know that you shouldn't think that if the author describes well a profession or a person, that's actually the author. But reading that story, I fell into that trap, and I thought that this guy must have worked on this guy has worked on a Norwegian whaling ship, because it didn't sound like research. It really sounded like you would know that environment. But is there something special in your research, or can you analyze it yourself?
That's wonderful to hear, because I really try hard to smooth out the joins between the research and the story if I can. No, I mean, I get the Whalers one, that did come about directly as a result of one particular article. So I'd read an article about whaling and how it was still going on with Norway and Japan. They were still, despite discussions or even outright bans, they were still whaling. And it had some quite horrific description as to what that would entail. And I hate that stuff, absolutely hate it. So of course I had to write about it. So that's where that story then came from. So it was about whaling, it was about old practices dying out. It was about toxic masculinity as well, in a way, this heroic romanticized image of going out to sea and doing all this manly stuff like hunting these whales, when actually you were grenading them in the head and then just carving them up on the ship. It was horrible. So that one came about of the article, and then what I'll always do then is I'll try and read as much. I do way too much research, to be honest, for a short story. So I'll buy books on whaling, or I'll look stuff up online, or if it's a different part of the world, which I often try to do if possible, then I'll go on YouTube and listen to people talking and stuff like that, so I can try and just chuck it all in this big melting pot. and try and convince people that, you know, I've been to the place, or I've done the job, or I've at least spoken to someone directly, when chances are I've not done any of those things. But I get suckered into it because I love that side of things. You know, the world is huge. There's so much stuff. It's so many places that I just get suckered into it. I did another story on salmon fishing, and for a brief period of my life, I knew more about salmon than I cared to, but I knew all the different types and how to fish them and all this stuff and little bits of Russian. And then once I'm on to the next story, it all kind of disperses. So makes room for new info, I think. But yeah, no, I love that side of things. So I'm glad that it shows, but doesn't make the story clunky, thankfully. So, but I try to make a conscious effort not to get stuck where I live. The whole write what you know idea really grates on me, because if I did that, I wouldn't want to write, because I know all that stuff. I want to find out new stuff and then tell people about that. And because I really love the genre, I love horror, I'm trying to also hopefully point out that it's everywhere. You know, it's all around the world, and you can go to Bangladesh and see the shipbreaking yards, and there's horror there, and you can go to Norway or Greenland, there's horror there. America, God, that's almost too easy, because you can just look at all the people there and all the different problems they have with gun control. There's horror there too. So I try to dot my stories around the globe as much as possible, with that in mind. And again, that's why there's so much research necessary, because I don't have the budget to travel the world, but I can do a lot of it thanks to the internet and our libraries and things. So.
And also your main characters, they are usually not this kind of writer, literary types, the main characters in your story.
Yeah.
Is that the same idea, that you maybe you are not writing about what you already know, but you want to describe different kinds of characters?
I think so, a little bit. I mean, because I got quite tired very quickly of. I mean, I love Stephen King, but he does a lot of writer characters that are writers, and I just get a bit tired of that. So I always told myself when I was young, before I was even published, if ever I have a writer in my story, the writing needs to be important to the story. So I think I've done a journalist in one story because I needed him to be reporting on a particular event, and I think I had a poet in another story, but that's about as close as I've got to it so far. I tend to avoid writing about writers if I can. I think in part because I know it's quite a small community anyway, especially indie presses and the small presses. So a lot of the people that are going to be reading my work are probably writers or trying to write or starting out writing themselves, and they don't necessarily want to hear about the same stuff they already know either. So that's partly it, but mostly it's just selfishness. I just don't want to write about stuff I already know, or think I know quite well. So I try to do new stuff. If I'm not interested or excited by the story I'm writing, it dies very, very quickly. So that's where the research helps, I think, because I'm always trying to keep it fresh or find something new. And then, as is often the case, it will snowball. It only takes one new fact you didn't know that you suddenly have this either a new idea to put in the story, or you have a new story idea entirely that you have to put on the shelf ready for next time, because whilst looking into whaling, you've just discovered this other deep sea fish that does this, this, or this, you know, that kind of stuff. So that's why I've gone off on a bit of a tangent there, but yeah, I mean, that's partly why I avoid the writing character, I think.
They are quite, not always, but often kind of people who are doing really physical stuff instead of reading. You know,
Adrenaline junkies.
Adrenaline junkies. What is it called? That gliding thing, or that parachute thing?
They're doing Freefalling. And a couple of them have done all sorts of things like base jumping and bungee jumping and, you know, whitewater rapids and stuff. It's funny, that's a lot of the stuff they do in that are things that used to be on my bucket list of stuff I really wanted to do.
But you haven't?
I haven't, and as I get older, I have no inclination to anymore. As I become older, I realise how mortal I am and how very, very easy it is for anything to go wrong. So I often weigh it up and I think, well, the rush of falling versus the chance of death, I think I could just do something a bit more tame, like write about it instead. Although I must say, whilst researching that, what came up again and again was how ridiculously safe a lot of these sports are. And when the bad things happen, it's usually on the point of negligence of the person themselves. They've become complacent, or they're just doing daft stuff like these people that do the free climbing up buildings just to get a decent selfie, and it's just like, why are you doing this? This is craziness. Yeah. But yeah, again, that's it. It's another outlet for things I haven't done yet or would like to do, or I'm no longer brave enough to do, and I just put them in a story.
one thing I'd like to ask you about genre fiction, horror fiction, maybe specifically. How is it in the UK to be a horror writer? Because I know that in many countries, including Finland, it's something that has been on the kind of margins.
Yeah.
And how is it in the UK nowadays? You have some kind of Ramsey Campbell and people like that, so there's a tradition.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a tradition to it. It's still sort of, I think, on the fringe and on the margins, and I think for the most part, the people that live in the genre like it there. I think the minute it becomes too mainstream and too popular, it'll lose a lot of the impact it's supposed to be having. Because I feel that even as a horror fan myself, if I read too many horror books or horror stories, you sort of become a bit immune to the scares and things. You need to go back into other genres to feel that fear again, or to be unnerved again. But I think, considering the genre's main purpose seems to be to unnerve people to some degree, or rub them the wrong way, then it's never going to be, I need another one of those, I need another one of those for everybody. It's going to be like that for a select few of us strange people, I guess, but most people only want that once in a while, I think. Obviously, there's probably all sorts of marketing reasons as well. It doesn't sell as much and blah, 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 and all that kind of thing. But the community here is brilliant. As you say, there's a strong tradition of it. Everyone is incredibly supportive. I really look forward to going to the conventions here and stuff and meeting up with old friends again. And funnily enough, don't often talk shop, so we're often just talking about the things we love, so the stuff we've read and the things we've seen, rather than the work itself. But then if you do want to talk about the work itself, I've got a lovely handful of people now that I can email and discuss things with if I'm having problems with stories. And if I never used to use beta readers before, but now I've got a few people that will read my stuff before I send it anywhere, just to let me know what they think, and vice versa. It's quite a nice perk. I now get to read work before anyone else from people I admire and respect in the genre, and I'm getting sneak peeks at their stuff. So the community is wonderful, absolutely wonderful. I think the only time it ever borders on the negative is on stuff like social media and things like that. It can get a little bit ugly sometimes, but that's, I think, sometimes down to the fact that, one, that's open to everyone, so it doesn't tend to be the close community anyway. It tends to be as you get bigger and bigger. And two, sometimes it's simply misreading, getting the wrong tone from a typed message on Facebook or Twitter or something like that. So they're very minor. Mostly it's a wonderful genre to work in, and everyone's really warm and some of the nicest people you're ever going to meet.
Yeah, I think social media, they sometimes compare it to road rage. You don't see the face, so you misinterpret people. It's easy to project all the negative things into kind of faceless people. What about your future publications, or maybe work in progress? Are there any? Can you reveal, or do you want to reveal anything about?
Yeah, no, I can. There's too much at the moment. There's way too much, because I took on a lot of things. So I'm doing my PhD at the moment, with the hopes to go back into teaching again, but at university. And for my PhD, I need to write a novel. So I'm doing a novel for that. That's particularly challenging because it has to be in order to deserve the PhD. So it does all this stuff with narrative and makes a bit of a jigsaw or a mosaic out of it, and it's got all these different figures and Sylvia Plath's in it and things like this. So I've got my poetry in there and whatnot. So that's quite a big project. I've got a novel I was already working on for me, just for fun. So I'm still trying to slug away at that. And I've just started writing for a games company, like Games Workshop. They do lots of sort of hobby stuff. They have this whole sort of fantasy universe and this science fiction universe. And they invited me to write for them for a little while. So I've done a couple of short stories for them, and I'm now working on a novel based in their world, which is fun. It's good fun. It's weird writing with someone else's intellectual property in mind. So they've got particular races that I should include, for example, or they've got particular ways they want my names to be and my places to be and stuff like that. So it's odd having a framework, but it's also quite nice seeing how far you can bend these rules and what you can do with it that's a bit different. So I'm working on 3 massive projects and feeling a bit sad because I'm not getting my short story fix in as much as I should. I had one out recently in Black Static, which was nice, because I hadn't been in the magazine for a year or so because of focusing on all this longer stuff. But that's what I'm doing at the moment, 3 novels, because I'm an idiot. I tend to work on one in the morning, that I have to because there's a deadline, and then one in the afternoon which I've got a bit longer for, and then if I really want to, I'll do some in the evening, but usually I'm too exhausted and I'll chill out in the evenings.
Okay, I would have more questions here, but I think our time is up. Thank you very much for you found. I think you're a busy man, so you found the time to have a short chat. And hopefully we'll see you at StokerCon or somewhere. But anyway, I'm looking forward to your 3 novels plus 10 short stories.
Let's hope so.
Okay, thank you very much, Ray Cluley.
Oh, a pleasure. Thank you very much too.